At the start of this gripping story, we meet Angela Carter, a distinguished black woman and colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, as she faces an unsettling experience at an airport. Dressed casually to blend into the crowd, Angela is ready to board her flight to an important military summit where she is scheduled to speak about diversity and equity in the armed forces, issues deeply tied to her career and personal journey. However, her routine trip takes an unexpected turn when she is stopped at the gate and questioned by the airline staff. Despite presenting her valid ticket and identification, Angela encounters skepticism and thinly veiled prejudice, challenging her presence in first class. The experience becomes a poignant reminder of the systemic biases she has faced throughout her life and career, setting the stage for a story about resilience, dignity, and a fight for justice and inclusion. Before diving into the developments of this dramatic story, please like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell to receive our fascinating stories. Colonel Angela Carter, a trailblazer in the U.S. Marine Corps, chose to dress in civilian attire for her journey, opting for a black leather jacket, plain white t-shirt, and dark jeans. This decision was deliberate. Angela, one of the few black women to rise to the rank of colonel, had learned through experience that wearing her uniform often attracted a mix of reactions: admiration from some and skepticism from others, who struggled to reconcile her rank with her appearance. On this day, she wanted to avoid the weight of judgment and assumptions that often followed her uniform. She aimed to blend in with the crowd, moving anonymously through the airport like any other traveler. Angela was on her way to an important military summit, where she was slated to deliver a critical speech on diversity and inclusion within the armed forces. This topic was not just an abstract idea for her, it was a mission born of personal experience. Having climbed the ranks in an institution historically lacking in representation for people like her, Angela understood the challenges of being overlooked, underestimated, and questioned. Her journey to colonel had been one of resilience, breaking barriers, and proving herself in an environment that wasn't always welcoming. The summit was a significant moment in her career and for the broader conversation about leadership, race, and gender in the military. Her speech would address not only the need for diversity, but also the necessity of systemic changes to ensure equity and fairness for all service members. As she adjusted her duffel bag and glanced at her phone, her focus was on the message she planned to deliver, a message that she hoped would inspire and challenge the audience of senior military officials to envision a more inclusive future. Colonel Angela Carter walked through the bustling airport with calm determination, her composed demeanor radiating quiet confidence. Though dressed in casual civilian clothing, a black leather jacket over a plain white t-shirt and dark jeans, her tall, athletic frame and focused expression naturally drew subtle glances from fellow travelers. She moved with purpose, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, blending into the crowd, yet standing out in a way she couldn't entirely avoid. As Angela approached the security checkpoint, the usual hustle and chatter of the airport surrounded her families, wrangling their luggage, business travelers engrossed in their phones, and vacationers buzzing with excitement. She joined the snaking line of travelers waiting to pass through security, keeping her expression neutral and her thoughts centered on the military summit she was heading to. This event wasn't just another professional engagement, it was an opportunity to deliver a powerful message about the importance of diversity and equity in the armed forces, a topic she was deeply passionate about. When Angela finally reached the TSA officer, she handed over her boarding pass and military identification with the practiced ease of someone used to navigating such processes. The officer, a young man in his early 20s, glanced at her documents and then back at her, his eyes briefly widening as he registered her rank. "Thank you, Colonel," he said with quiet respect, handing her papers back. Angela acknowledged him with a polite nod but kept her composure, preferring to avoid drawing further attention to herself. For now, her credentials were respected, and she was allowed to pass through without issue. As she moved to retrieve her shoes and bag from the conveyor belt, Angela couldn't help but notice a few lingering gazes from passengers nearby. She was no stranger to such reactions. People often took note of her striking presence and serious demeanor, but she appreciated that no one had yet connected her to her rank or achievements. This fleeting anonymity was what she'd hoped for, allowing her to focus on the task ahead rather than the judgment or assumptions she might encounter. Yet, beneath the surface, Angela remained prepared for the possibility that her journey wouldn't remain so uneventful. As Colonel Angela Carter approached the boarding gate, she stepped into the first-class line with her ticket in hand, ready for a routine boarding process. The announcements echoed overhead, and the steady shuffle of passengers created a familiar pre-flight rhythm. Angela had traveled countless times before, and this trip was supposed to be no different. Focused on her upcoming speech, she thought little of her surroundings as she joined the line, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But as she reached the gate agent, the atmosphere shifted. The agent, a middle-aged woman with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze, hesitated upon seeing Angela. Her expression tightened as she scanned the ticket and glanced back up, her skepticism unmistakable. "Excuse me," the agent said, her voice tinged with doubt. "Are you sure you're in the right line? This is for first-class passengers." Angela froze momentarily, not out of confusion but out of frustration. She had encountered this scenario far too many times before, questioned, doubted, made to prove she belonged. Yet, she maintained her composure, her face calm and unreadable. "Yes, I'm in the right line," she replied evenly, handing over her first-class ticket and ID. The gate agent took the documents, her fingers lingering as she inspected them for what felt like an unnecessarily long time. Angela stood, silently, her patience wearing thin, but her resolve unshaken. Around her, other passengers began to notice the exchange, some glancing curiously in her direction. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. The agent's hesitation was clear, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. Though Angela's documents were in perfect order, it seemed the agent couldn't reconcile the image of a casually dressed black woman with a first-class ticket, and certainly not with the military credentials displayed on her ID. The moment stretched uncomfortably as the agent continued to scrutinize Angela's paperwork, as though searching for a mistake or reason to deny it. Finally, after an excruciating pause, the agent handed back the documents with a forced smile that barely masked her doubt. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, her tone still hesitant. Angela took her papers, nodded politely, and stepped forward to board, her composure intact but her irritation simmering beneath the surface. It was yet another reminder of the biases she faced, even in the most routine of circumstances. As Colonel Angela Carter handed over her first-class ticket and military ID, the gate agent's reaction was immediate yet subtle, an almost imperceptible shift in demeanor, a narrowing of the eyes. What should have been a seamless process began to unravel as the agent hesitated, her skepticism evident. She held Angela's ID in her hands, turning it over and studying it with undue care, as if the credentials before her couldn't possibly be genuine. "Just a moment," the agent said, her voice tightly controlled but betraying a thinly veiled suspicion. Angela stood silently, her expression calm but her patience beginning to wear thin. She had seen this all before, the prolonged scrutiny, the unspoken doubts. In her years of service, Angela had faced countless moments like this, where her achievements and rank were questioned simply because they didn't align with someone else's preconceived notions of what a leader should look like. Around them, the scene at the gate continued as other passengers moved through the process with ease. Some glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the apparent delay. Angela could feel their eyes on her, and she knew what many of them were likely thinking. Why is she being questioned? What's taking so long? Yet no one spoke up. They simply observed, some with faintly sympathetic expressions, others with quiet judgment. The gate agent's doubt seemed to deepen the longer she examined Angela's ID. It was as though the woman was searching for a flaw, something that would confirm her underlying assumptions. Angela's appearance, a casually dressed black woman in civilian clothes, didn't match the gate agent's image of someone who could afford first class or hold a senior military rank. Angela knew these biases well. They weren't always voiced aloud, but instead revealed in subtle ways: hesitations, extra questions, or, as in this case, unnecessary scrutiny. "Can you wait here for a moment while I confirm something?" the agent finally asked, her tone now more clipped. She stepped away from the counter, ID and ticket still in hand, leaving Angela standing alone. The murmurs of passengers around her grew louder. Angela remained rooted in place, her posture calm but her mind racing. She had prepared herself for situations like this, but that didn't make them any less infuriating. Minutes ticked by as the gate agent consulted with a colleague. Angela could see them speaking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in her direction. It was a scene she had grown painfully accustomed to. A moment of doubt turned into an unnecessary ordeal because of someone's inability to reconcile her identity with her accomplishments. She thought about her years in the military, the sacrifices she had made, and the barriers she had overcome. Her rank as colonel wasn't just a title. It was the result of hard work, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to proving herself in spaces where she was often underestimated. Finally, the gate agent returned, her expression carefully neutral, but still tinged with hesitation. "We're just being cautious," she said, as though that justified the delay. Thank you for your patience." Angela took her ID and ticket back without a word, her expression unreadable. She had no intention of causing a scene, but she also wasn't about to let the moment pass without acknowledging the underlying issue. "Cautious?" she repeated, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly are you being cautious about?" The agent faltered, caught off guard by Angela's directness. "We just have protocols to follow," she stammered, clearly uncomfortable. Angela held her gaze, letting the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. "I see. And do these protocols usually involve questioning the legitimacy of first-class tickets or military IDs?" The tension was palpable now, the air thick with unspoken truths. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to listen while others openly watched the exchange. The gate agent's face flushed slightly, her earlier confidence now replaced with visible discomfort. "It's just unusual, that's all," she said, her voice quieter. "We don't want to make any mistakes." Angela nodded slowly, her composure unshaken. "Mistakes happen when people rely on assumptions rather than facts," she said pointedly. The gate agent's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. After a brief pause, Angela moved forward, her steps measured and deliberate. She had been allowed to board, but the experience left a bitter taste, a stark reminder of the biases she continued to face. As Angela walked down the jet bridge, she couldn't shake the frustration building inside her. It wasn't just about the delay or the scrutiny. It was about the broader reality this moment represented. She had worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks, proving her worth over and over again. Yet here she was, still having to justify her presence in a space she had every right to occupy. While she remained composed outwardly, inside she resolved that this wouldn't be the end of the conversation. For Angela, every moment like this was fuel for the fight for equity and justice, a fight she carried with her, both on the battlefield and beyond. The confrontation at the gate took a sharp turn when the gate agent, still unsure of how to proceed, called over additional staff. Angela Carter stood silently as two more airline employees approached, their eyes darting between her and the gate agent. The growing cluster of personnel was already drawing attention from nearby passengers, some whispering among themselves, others openly staring. Angela could feel the weight of their gazes, the mounting tension in the air unmistakable. What had started as a simple boarding process was now evolving into a spectacle, one that she had no choice but to endure. The gate agent began explaining the situation to her colleagues in hushed tones, gesturing occasionally toward Angela. Though she couldn't hear the words, Angela recognized the undertone in their body language. The shared uncertainty, the subtle but clear implication that something about her didn't add up. Her patience was wearing thin, but she kept her expression calm, refusing to let her frustration show. This wasn't the first time her presence in a space had been questioned, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Moments later, two airport security officers appeared, summoned to the scene. Their presence instantly escalated the situation. Angela's stomach sank as they approached, the uniformed officers exuding authority as they scanned the scene. She had seen this play out before, the involvement of security, the quiet but powerful assumption of guilt. The officers spoke briefly with the gate agent, their voices too low for Angela to hear, but their glances in her direction said everything. The narrative was already forming, shaped by biases too deeply ingrained to be ignored. "Ma'am, can we see your ID and ticket again?" one of the officers asked as they approached her. His tone was polite but firm, the underlying skepticism evident. Angela handed over her documents without a word, her movements controlled and deliberate. She knew any sign of impatience or irritation could be misinterpreted as aggression. As they examined her papers, the silence grew heavier, punctuated only by the murmurs of onlookers and the occasional beep from the gate scanner. The officers scrutinized her ID and ticket just as the gate agent had done earlier, their expressions unreadable. Angela stood still, her posture straight and her face calm, but inside she felt the familiar heat of frustration and indignation rising. She had served her country for years, earning the rank of colonel through hard work, sacrifice, and unyielding determination. Yet here she was, being treated like a suspect rather than the accomplished leader she was. One of the officers looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. "You're a colonel?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of disbelief. Angela met his gaze evenly. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice steady. She could see the doubt lingering in his eyes, the unspoken question, how can that be true? It wasn't the first time her rank had been met with skepticism, and it stung no less now than it had in the past. The gate agent, sensing the tension but unwilling to back down, interjected. "It's just a precaution," she said, her voice laced with feigned reassurance. "We have to verify everything. It's standard protocol." Angela's jaw tightened at the word precaution. She knew what it really meant. It wasn't about protocol. It was about the assumptions they were making, the prejudices they weren't willing to acknowledge. Passengers in the vicinity had stopped pretending not to watch. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing the unfolding scene. Angela could feel their judgment, their silent questions hanging in the air. Was she in the wrong? Was she overreacting? Or was this yet another instance of someone being unfairly singled out because of the color of their skin? Angela took a deep breath, grounding herself. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unsure of how to respond. It wasn't her credentials they doubted, it was her presence, her achievements, her right to stand where she stood. The tension hung thick in the air, the racial undertones impossible to ignore. Finally, one of the officers handed back her ID and ticket, his demeanor slightly softened. "Everything checks out," he said, almost reluctantly. Angela accepted her documents with a polite nod, but the damage was already done. The stares, the doubts, the unnecessary scrutiny, it all served as a painful reminder of the biases she faced, even in spaces where her rank and accomplishments should have spoken for themselves. As Angela moved toward the jet bridge, she felt the weight of the incident settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about a delay or inconvenience. It was about the broader reality of being a Black woman in a world that too often refused to see her for who she truly was. And while she had endured this moment with grace, she resolved that it wouldn't pass without action. This was yet another chapter in her ongoing fight for justice, equality, and the recognition she and others like her deserved. Colonel Angela Carter stood at the gate, her composure steady despite the growing frustration simmering beneath the surface. Around her, the air was thick with tension, the kind that comes when unspoken biases collide with an individual's undeniable presence. Angela's patience had been tested repeatedly during this ordeal, but she refused to let her emotions dictate her actions. Years of navigating spaces that questioned her worth had taught her that her greatest strength lay in her ability to remain calm under pressure, even when others failed to do the same. The gate agent, still flustered from the earlier confrontation, avoided Angela's gaze as she whispered to her colleagues and the security officers standing nearby. Their hushed conversation was laden with doubt, skepticism, and the unspoken question: could this woman truly be who she claims to be? Angela, with her first-class ticket and military ID, was a disruption to their expectations, and they were struggling to reconcile her presence with their assumptions. Angela stood firm, her stance deliberate and her face a mask of calm determination. She had nothing to prove. Her credentials, her rank, and her achievements spoke for themselves. Yet the scrutiny she faced was an all too familiar reminder that for many, her very existence in spaces like these was cause for questioning. She knew she was being tested, and she was determined to pass this test on her own terms. "Ma'am, please understand," the gate agent finally said, her voice tight with discomfort. "We just need to be thorough. It's unusual, that's all." The word unusual hung in the air, heavy with implications. Angela met the agent's eyes, her calm demeanor belying the storm of frustration brewing inside her. "Unusual," she repeated, her voice measured but firm. "What exactly about the situation do you find unusual?" The agent faltered, her confidence shaken by Angela's directness. "It's just, we need to verify your information," she stammered, glancing nervously at the security officers. Angela's gaze didn't waver. "I've presented my ID and my boarding pass," she said evenly. "Both are valid, and there's nothing here that warrants additional verification, unless, of course, you're implying something else." Her words cut through the tension like a knife, leaving no room for ambiguity. Angela wasn't going to let the moment pass without addressing the biases fueling this encounter. The security officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. They were used to passengers either becoming defensive or shrinking under the weight of authority, but Angela did neither. She stood tall, her posture unwavering, her voice steady. She was not asking for special treatment. She was demanding the respect she deserved. The murmurs of nearby passengers grew louder. Some were watching intently, their phones held at the ready to capture the moment. Angela was keenly aware of the growing audience, but she didn't let it distract her. This wasn't about putting on a show. It was about asserting her right to be treated with dignity. She had faced too many moments like this in her career to let this one go unanswered. One of the security officers cleared his throat, stepping forward as though to defuse the situation. "Colonel Carter?" he said, his voice more respectful now. "We're not questioning your credentials. It's just, unusual for someone in your position to travel in civilian clothes. It raised a few questions, that's all." Angela's expression didn't change, but inside, the words stung. She knew exactly what he meant, even if he didn't say it outright. It wasn't just the civilian clothes, it was the color of her skin, her gender, and the way those aspects of her identity clashed with her expectations of what a colonel should look like. She took a deep breath, grounding herself before responding. "I appreciate your explanation," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But let me be clear. My rank and my achievements are not diminished by the fact that I'm wearing a leather jacket instead of a uniform, and they certainly aren't diminished by who I am. If this is about protocol, then I expect you to follow it fairly and without prejudice." Her words landed heavily, silencing the murmurs around her. The gate agent flushed, clearly uncomfortable, but unable to refute Angela's point. The security officers looked at one another, uncertain of how to proceed. Angela didn't move, didn't back down. She had no intention of escalating the situation, but she also wouldn't let it slide. She had spent her entire career fighting for the recognition she deserved, and she wasn't about to let a gate agent or a security team undermine her legitimacy. After a long, tense pause, the lead security officer finally nodded. "You're right, Colonel. We apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his voice subdued. He gestured toward the jet bridge. "You're cleared to board." Angela accepted the apology with a curt nod, picking up her bag and stepping forward. But as she walked toward the jet bridge, the weight of the encounter lingered. This wasn't just about a delayed boarding process. It was about the countless moments she had endured where her presence was questioned, her identity doubted, her worth diminished in the eyes of others. As she settled into her first-class seat, Angela allowed herself a moment to breathe, to reflect. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't caused a scene, but she had made her point. She had stood firm in the face of bias and forced them to confront their assumptions. This small victory was one of many she'd had to claim throughout her life, a reminder of how far she'd come and how much work still lay ahead. For Angela, the fight for equity and justice wasn't just a professional mission, it was deeply personal. And she was ready to continue that fight, one encounter at a time. The tension at the gate had reached its peak, and Colonel Angela Carter found herself the center of a growing spectacle. Passengers nearby paused their own pre-flight routines to watch the unfolding scene. Some cast sympathetic glances, while others appeared skeptical, their expressions quietly questioning whether Angela truly belonged in the first-class line. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, fragments of curiosity and judgment carried on the air. Are they holding her up?" one person murmured, while another muttered, "She doesn't look like a colonel to me." Angela heard the words without reacting, her face an unreadable mask of calm determination. She had learned long ago how to steel herself against such judgments, but the familiarity of the experience didn't make it any less exhausting. A few passengers took out their phones, capturing the incident from various angles. The sight of cameras made the gate staff and security officers visibly uncomfortable, but they didn't back down. Angela noticed the flashes of light and the soft hum of recording, understanding that this moment was no longer confined to the gate. It was becoming a public narrative, one that would likely extend far beyond this airport. The murmurs grew louder as more people tuned into the confrontation. "Why is security here?" someone asked, their tone a mix of confusion and concern. "She doesn't seem like she's causing trouble." Yet, amidst the sympathetic voices, there were also the inevitable murmurs of judgment. "Maybe there's more to the story," one man whispered to his companion. "She must have done something to draw all this attention." Angela stood tall, refusing to let the stares, whispers, or cameras shake her resolve. She had spent her entire career proving herself in spaces where she was underestimated, questioned, and scrutinized. This was no different. Her posture was steady, her expression calm, but her mind was racing. She knew the assumptions being made. She could feel the weight of them pressing down like an invisible burden. Some passengers seemed torn, caught between supporting her and avoiding involvement. A middle-aged woman nearby spoke quietly to a gate agent, her concern evident but her voice too soft to make an impact. Others simply watched, phones held high, as though waiting for something dramatic to happen. Angela was keenly aware of the narrative forming in their minds. To some, she was an accomplished colonel unjustly treated. To others, she was simply a traveler who didn't fit the first-class mold. As the situation dragged on, Angela felt the emotional toll building, but she didn't waver. The growing crowd, the stares, and the whispers were all noise. What mattered was her truth, and she refused to let the biases of a few define her story. The situation at the gate finally shifted when a supervisor arrived, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was an older woman, perhaps in her early 50s, with a professional demeanor that contrasted sharply with the flustered gate agent and the uncertain security officers. Her eyes swept over the scene, taking in the gathered passengers, the raised phones, and Angela Carter, standing tall but visibly weary from the ordeal. "Good evening," the supervisor said, her voice calm but firm. "What seems to be the issue here?" The gate agent stepped forward, hastily recounting her version of events. As the explanation unfolded, Angela stood silently, her expression composed but her patience thin. She had already endured enough. Every prolonged glance, every whispered comment, every delay chipped away at her reserve. Now, as she watched the supervisor absorb the situation, Angela couldn't help but wonder how much of this would have been avoided had her identity not been in question from the start. The supervisor turned her attention to Angela, her gaze steady and respectful. "Colonel Carter," she said, addressing Angela by her rank, "I'd like to personally apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. Let me assure you this matter will be resolved immediately." Angela nodded, her face betraying little of the frustration and exhaustion she felt. "Thank you," she replied evenly, her tone polite but firm. "I appreciate your acknowledgement, but this has gone beyond an inconvenience. I've provided valid credentials multiple times, yet I've been subjected to unnecessary scrutiny. I'd like to know why." The supervisor paused, clearly grappling with the gravity of Angela's words. Around them, the passengers continued to watch, some lowering their phones out of respect, others still recording. The supervisor glanced briefly at the gate agent, whose flushed face betrayed a mixture of guilt and discomfort. "You're absolutely right," the supervisor admitted. "This should not have happened. I'll be speaking with my staff to ensure that we address this appropriately. In the meantime, you are cleared to board, and I sincerely apologize for the way this has been handled." The words were welcome, but they did little to ease the weight Angela felt pressing down on her. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about the deeper reality of what had transpired. She had been questioned, doubted, and treated as though she didn't belong, not because of her behavior or credentials, but because of biases rooted in her appearance. The gate agent, now standing awkwardly to the side, muttered a quiet sorry that barely registered. Angela didn't respond, choosing instead to focus on the supervisor. "I hope this is a learning moment for your team," she said, her voice steady. "What happened here today isn't just about me. It's about the assumptions made and the systemic biases that allowed those assumptions to dictate behavior." The supervisor nodded, her expression sincere. "You're absolutely right, Colonel Carter. I will make sure this is addressed with my team, and I will escalate this to ensure it doesn't happen again." Satisfied, at least for the moment, Angela nodded and gathered her belongings. The security officers stepped aside, their earlier authority now subdued, and Angela made her way toward the jet bridge. But as she walked, the emotional toll of the encounter began to settle in. She could feel the lingering stares, the weight of what had just unfolded, and the knowledge that moments like these were far too common not just for her, but for countless others who faced similar biases daily. By the time Angela reached her seat in the first-class cabin, the adrenaline that had kept her steady began to fade, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and quiet anger. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and sank into her seat, staring out the window as the other passengers filed in. Some gave her brief glances, their expressions unreadable, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The entire ordeal had left her emotionally drained, and though she was relieved to finally be on board, the experience weighed heavily on her mind. Angela thought about the speech she was set to deliver at the military summit, a message centered on diversity and equity within the armed forces. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, preparing to advocate for systemic change, while simultaneously being reminded of the very biases she was fighting to address. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of a broader issue, one that extended beyond airports and into every corner of society. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to center herself. The supervisor's apology had been sincere, but Angela knew that words alone wouldn't solve the problem. Real change required more than apologies. It required action, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Angela resolved to channel the frustration and exhaustion from this experience into her speech. The incident at the gate had only reinforced the urgency of her mission. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been overlooked, doubted, or underestimated because of who they were. And as the engines roared to life, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for equity wasn't easy, but it was a fight she was determined to continue, no matter the obstacles. As Colonel Angela Carter settled into her first-class seat, the emotional weight of the confrontation at the gate began to sink in. The adrenaline that had sustained her composure during the ordeal faded, leaving her with a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and a sense of déjà vu. This wasn't the first time her identity had been questioned, nor was it the first time she had felt the sting of systemic bias. For Angela, this moment was a painful reminder of the recurring challenges she had faced throughout her career and her life. Staring out the window at the bustling activity on the tarmac, Angela's thoughts turned inward. Despite her rank, achievements, and years of service, she was still forced to prove her worth in situations where others would be unquestioned. It wasn't just the skepticism at the gate, it was the accumulation of countless moments where her presence in spaces of power and privilege had been met with doubt or disbelief. Her credentials were always in question, her accomplishments often viewed through a lens of suspicion. The reality of being a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated system was one of constant scrutiny, a need to work harder, achieve more, and remain flawless in the face of relentless challenges. Angela thought back to her early days in the military, where she had first encountered the unspoken but ever-present barriers of bias. Rising through the ranks had been an uphill battle, requiring her to navigate not only the rigorous demands of her role, but also the subtle and overt prejudices of those around her. She had faced moments of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, often by those who couldn't reconcile her identity with her position. Yet, she had persevered, refusing to let the weight of systemic bias deter her from her goals. The incident at the gate felt like a microcosm of those larger struggles, a moment that encapsulated the exhausting pattern of having to prove, again and again, that she belonged. It wasn't just about the skepticism of the gate agent or the security officers. It was about what their doubt represented. It was about a society that still struggled to see Black women as leaders, as first-class passengers, as people deserving of the spaces they occupied. As the plane taxied to the runway, Angela replayed the confrontation in her mind. She hadn't raised her voice or lost her composure, even when her patience was tested. Yet, she couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. Why was it always on her to stay calm, to be the bigger person, to educate others through her restraint? Why did the burden of proving her worth fall squarely on her shoulders, while the biases of others went unchecked? Angela's thoughts shifted to the upcoming military summit and the speech she was set to deliver. Her message was clear. Diversity and equity were not optional. They were essential for the future of the armed forces. Her speech highlighted the importance of dismantling systemic barriers and creating pathways for underrepresented groups to lead. The irony of preparing to deliver that message, while still battling the very issues she sought to address, was not lost on her. If anything, the incident at the airport reinforced the urgency of her mission. She thought about the countless others who faced similar struggles but lacked the platform or rank to push back. The young Black woman starting her career in the military, the man of color passed over for promotion, the person who felt invisible in a room full of decision-makers. Angela's fight was for them as much as it was for herself. Her voice, her rank, her platform, they were tools she could use to create change, and she intended to wield them with purpose. Yet the exhaustion was real. The emotional toll of constantly proving her legitimacy weighed heavily on Angela, even as she resolved to push forward. She knew the fight for equity wasn't a sprint but a marathon, and moments like these were part of the long journey toward systemic change. Still, there were days when the fight felt overwhelming, when the burden of carrying not just her own ambitions but the hopes of others felt too heavy to bear. Angela closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of stillness. She reflected on the progress she had made, on the barriers she had broken, and on the people who had supported her along the way. She thought of her mentors, her peers, and the younger officers who looked up to her as a role model. Their belief in her fueled her determination, reminding her why she continued to stand firm in the face of adversity. As the plane lifted into the air, Angela opened her eyes and looked out at the horizon. She knew there was no easy solution to the biases embedded in society, but she also knew she couldn't let moments like the one at the gate define her. Instead, she would use them as fuel for her advocacy, as examples of why her mission mattered. Her thoughts returned to her speech. It wasn't just about highlighting the need for diversity, it was about demanding accountability, challenging systems to do better, and empowering individuals to believe they deserved a seat at the table. For Angela, this wasn't just a professional duty, it was personal. It was a fight for herself, for those who had come before her, and for those who would follow. As the plane climbed higher, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't change what had happened at the gate, but she could control how she responded. And in that moment, she resolved to keep pushing forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong. Her journey was far from over, and the fight for equity was one she would continue with unwavering resolve. The incident at the airport didn't end when Colonel Angela Carter finally took her seat on the plane. Unbeknownst to her at the time, the confrontation at the gate had been recorded by several passengers and quickly began circulating online. Within hours, the videos gained traction across social media platforms, sparking a firestorm of conversations about racism, systemic bias, and the assumptions people make about who belongs in positions of power. The footage captured everything: Angela's calm yet firm demeanor, the prolonged scrutiny of her documents, the involvement of security officers, and the visible discomfort of the airline staff as they fumbled through the situation. Many viewers were struck by Angela's grace under pressure, commending her for standing her ground without raising her voice or escalating the situation. Comments poured in, praising her resilience and poise. "This is what leadership looks like," one user wrote. "She didn't just defend herself, she exposed the biases in a way no one could ignore." However, the videos also sparked outrage. Viewers expressed frustration and anger at the treatment Angela had received, with many pointing out the racial undertones of the encounter. Hashtags like "Flying While Black" and "Colonel Carter" began trending, amplifying the discussion. People shared their own experiences of being profiled or unfairly questioned in similar settings, turning Angela's story into a larger conversation about systemic prejudice in travel, workplaces, and beyond. Civil rights activists and public figures joined the discourse, calling out the airline for its mishandling of the situation. "This isn't just about one woman being treated unfairly," one prominent activist tweeted. "It's about the biases embedded in systems that make moments like these so common." Colonel Carter's calm response shouldn't have been necessary. She shouldn't have had to prove herself in the first place. Military veterans and current service members also chimed in, expressing their disappointment and solidarity. "Colonel Carter represents the best of us," one veteran posted. "Her service, rank, and leadership are beyond reproach. The fact that she was questioned at all is a disgrace." But the conversation wasn't without its critics. Some online voices questioned whether the situation had been exaggerated or misinterpreted, pointing to the airline's need for caution. Others leaned on familiar tropes, accusing Angela of overreacting or playing the victim. These dissenting opinions only fueled the conversation, as supporters quickly countered with facts about systemic racism and implicit bias. Angela's inbox began to flood with messages as the story reached her. Some were from strangers offering support and sharing their own stories of prejudice. Others came from media outlets requesting interviews or statements. The attention was overwhelming. But Angela knew this moment wasn't just about her. It had become a symbol of a much larger issue. The airline, now facing intense public scrutiny, released a statement acknowledging the incident and promising an internal review. They apologized for any inconvenience caused, but stopped short of addressing the deeper concerns raised by the viral footage. This vague response only intensified the backlash, with many calling for more concrete actions, such as diversity and bias training for their employees. The conversation online continued to grow, branching out into discussions about equity, representation, and the importance of challenging stereotypes. Angela's name became synonymous with grace under pressure, but also with the ongoing fight for systemic change. Her story resonated not just with those who had faced similar biases, but also with those who saw in her a powerful example of how to confront injustice head-on. While Angela appreciated the support, she also felt the weight of the attention. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but it had found her nonetheless. As her story spread, she recognized an opportunity to amplify the message she was already preparing to deliver at the military summit. The incident at the airport wasn't just a moment of personal injustice. It was a call to action, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As she prepared to address the growing wave of public interest, Angela resolved to use the attention wisely. She would share her experience not for sympathy, but to drive change, to highlight the systemic issues that led to moments like these, and to remind people that equity and justice were not abstract ideals, they were necessities for a truly fair and inclusive society. The viral attention had turned her experience into a movement, and Angela was ready to lead it. Colonel Angela Carter sat in her hotel room, her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. Messages of support poured in from across the country, strangers sharing their admiration for her composure, friends and colleagues expressing their outrage at the injustice she had faced, and media outlets requesting interviews. The incident at the airport had gone viral, and Angela's story was now at the center of a growing national conversation about systemic racism, bias, and equity. Initially, Angela felt overwhelmed by the attention. She hadn't sought to become the face of a movement, she had simply been trying to board a plane. But as she read the messages and reflected on the overwhelming support, she realized that this was bigger than her. Her experience had struck a chord, resonating with countless people who saw in her story a reflection of their own struggles. This was an opportunity to push for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who faced similar challenges. The decision didn't come easily. Angela had spent much of her career navigating the delicate balance of challenging injustice while maintaining professionalism, particularly as a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. Speaking out would mean stepping into the spotlight in a way she hadn't anticipated, opening herself up to public scrutiny and criticism. But the messages of solidarity reminded her of the power of her voice and the responsibility that came with her platform. Angela made up her mind. She would speak out not just to recount what had happened to her, but to address the broader issues of systemic bias and prejudice that affected so many others. Her story was just one example of a much larger problem, and she knew that sharing it could spark meaningful conversations and potentially action. She drafted a statement, carefully choosing her words. It wasn't about anger or blame. It was about accountability and the urgent need for change. "What happened to me at the airport wasn't just about me," she wrote. "It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the systems that perpetuate inequity. This is a moment to reflect and do better, not just for me, but for all those who face similar challenges." As she prepared to share her story publicly, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident had reminded her why she had dedicated her career to advocating for equity and inclusion. Now she was ready to take that mission beyond the military, using her voice to challenge society as a whole, to confront its biases and strive for a more just future. Colonel Angela Carter stood confidently at the podium, facing a room packed with reporters, cameras flashing incessantly as the crowd buzzed with anticipation. The incident at the airport had brought her to this moment, where she would address not only her personal experience, but the broader issues it represented. Dressed in her military uniform, the insignia on her chest a testament to her rank and service, Angela embodied both authority and resilience. She began her speech with a calm but firm tone, recounting the events at the airport as an example of the biases many people face daily. "What happened to me wasn't just an isolated incident," she said, her voice steady but passionate. "It was a reflection of the systemic barriers that persist in our institutions, barriers that too often reduce people to assumptions based on appearance, race, or gender." Angela didn't linger on her personal story. Instead, she used it as a springboard to address the larger issues at hand. "This isn't about diversity for diversity's sake," she continued. "It's about equity, ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to succeed, to lead, and to thrive, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Equity goes beyond checking boxes or meeting quotas. It's about creating systems that are fair, inclusive, and just. Her words resonated with the audience, drawing nods from some reporters and looks of reflection from others. Angela spoke not just about the military, but about institutions across society, challenging them to take a hard look at the biases embedded within their structures. "We can't move forward as a nation if we allow these biases to go unchecked," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's time for action." Angela ended her speech with a call to action, urging institutions to implement systemic reforms that prioritize fairness and representation. "This is not just my fight," she concluded. "It's a fight for all of us, for a future where merit, dedication, and integrity are the only measures of success, and where no one is made to feel like they don't belong." As she stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into applause. Angela's message was clear, her resolve unshaken. This wasn't just a speech. It was a rallying cry for real, meaningful change. The fallout from Colonel Angela Carter's airport ordeal continued to ripple across the nation, sparking intense discussions about systemic bias and accountability. Under mounting public pressure, the airline issued a formal apology, acknowledging the incident and the shortcomings in how it had been handled. "We deeply regret the experience Colonel Carter faced and are committed to ensuring it never happens again," the statement read. Alongside the apology, the airline announced plans to implement mandatory bias training for all employees, emphasizing the need for awareness and equitable treatment in customer interactions. While the airline's response was a step forward, Angela understood that real change required more than statements and promises. Her calm yet firm handling of the situation, coupled with her powerful speech at the press conference, had elevated her into the national spotlight as a prominent advocate for equity and inclusion. Her story resonated with millions, not just because of what had happened to her, but because it reflected the lived experiences of so many others. Angela embraced this new role with determination. She began speaking at forums, conferences, and public events, sharing her story to shed light on the pervasive nature of implicit bias and the need for systemic reforms. Her message was clear. Equity isn't just about fixing individual incidents, it's about transforming the systems that allow such incidents to occur in the first place. Her advocacy extended beyond the military, reaching into corporate spaces, educational institutions, and public policy discussions. Civil rights organizations and equity-focused groups rallied around her, amplifying her message and using her story as a call to action. Meanwhile, her social media presence grew exponentially as people from all walks of life shared their support in similar experiences of bias and exclusion. Angela's voice became a powerful catalyst for change, inspiring individuals and organizations alike to confront uncomfortable truths and take meaningful steps toward inclusion. Though the incident at the airport had been deeply frustrating, Angela turned it into an opportunity to drive awareness and action, proving that even in the face of adversity, one voice can spark a movement for justice. Colonel Angela Carter's experience at the airport became more than just a moment of personal adversity. It transformed into a platform for lasting impact. Embracing her newfound visibility, Angela dedicated herself to advocating for systemic change, using her voice to address the deeper inequities that pervaded not only the military, but also society at large. She spoke with clarity and conviction, challenging institutions to confront their biases and adopt practices that ensured fairness and inclusion for all. Angela's advocacy centered on empowering underrepresented voices. She partnered with organizations working to dismantle systemic barriers, mentoring young leaders from marginalized communities and encouraging them to step into spaces of power. Her speeches resonated with audiences across industries, inspiring a movement toward accountability and equity. Beyond her public appearances, Angela worked tirelessly behind the scenes, consulting with policymakers and institutions to implement meaningful reforms. She emphasized that true change required more than surface-level diversity. It demanded equity, representation, and a willingness to rebuild systems from the ground up. Through her unwavering commitment, Angela became a symbol of resilience and progress, proving that adversity could be a catalyst for transformation. Her legacy was not just in her rank or achievements, but in the lives she touched and the change she inspired, ensuring that others would find their voices and take their rightful place at the table.